Welcome to the Discover Health podcast, where we explore the power of gut health, nutrition, and lifestyle to help you feel your best every day. I'm Dr. Josh Sharp, your guide on this journey to better digestion, more energy, and overall well-being. Each week, we'll dive into expert insights, practical tips, and real-life strategies to help you discover health. Ready to start discovering? Let's hit the trail. Welcome back to another episode of Discover Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Joshua Sharp, and joining me today is a very special guest, Dr. Julie Benvenuto. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Josh. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Julie is the owner of Amplified Connections Counseling. She holds a master's degree in professional counseling and a PhD in whole medicine and healing nutrition. With a deep commitment to integrative healing, she specializes in uncovering the root of dysfunction and how problems interconnect in physical, mental, and spiritual levels. Drawing from a holistic approach, Dr. Julie blends evidence-based counseling practices with whole person insight to guide individuals toward lasting wellness and transformation. Passionate about empowering others, Dr. Julie creates a safe and insightful space for healing, self-discovery, and true alignment with God's original purpose for our lives. Her greatest passion is training other counselors and life coaches, and she has served as a consultant for major Christian television network and several Dallas-Fort Worth area pastoral teams. So, Dr. Julie, thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you.
So, one question I love to ask all my guests is, how did you become interested in what you're doing now, and what made you want to become a practitioner working with clients?
Yes, so I have two parts to that answer. One of the silly parts of that answer is that I actually didn't know that I was going to do counseling until I finished my bachelor's degree. And one of my professors said to me, "You're getting your master's degree, right?" And I was like, "Oh, I guess I am. Yes, sure. Yes, I am. Shoot, what do I want to do now?" So then I just started asking people around, what am I good at? And then I started to get a lot of feedback about the fact that I'm a really good listener. And I just kind of played with, what does that mean to get paid to listen? And so that's really what started down the counseling path. But was cool about that is that I really believe that the most painful experiences that we have been through create our purpose. When you've gone through something difficult, that in itself is what qualifies you for what the point is for you to continue living, for you to give back to the population. And so, for whatever reason, I didn't see that on the front end of it. But looking back now, with that hindsight being 2020, I grew up with both parents being addicts, and I was removed from their home because of their addictions. And there was just a lot of things that I had to fight for and to fight through as a young girl who felt like an orphan in every way possible and felt unwanted and abandoned. And there was things that just didn't come easily for me because of the way that that was set up. And so I just realized, hey, I made it through this. You know, God had his hand on me, and there was some things that I must have done right in this. So somebody else has got to be able to benefit from this. And then I started actually using that once I became a practitioner. And I found that a lot of my clients felt better knowing that it wasn't somebody just coming at them with a textbook to say, okay, you know, page 42 told me to tell you this, but to say, yeah, anxiety sucks. And when your parents have not been reliable, I know how that feels. And of course, I don't turn it into my story all the time, but just them knowing that I'm coming from a lens of experience instead of knowledge brings a lot of peace for them.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful thing. And so many different practitioners of different disciplines that I've interviewed and worked with in the past, they've got a story of their own. And
Right.
oftentimes, what they do is a result of some difficulty either they've experienced themselves, exactly as you said, or maybe a family member or a loved one. They're trying to find ways to help them. And in the process, they're improving their skills and then they become able to help others. And so it's a beautiful thing when you're able to use some of those difficulties to bless others.
So true.
So, one of the things that I was excited to talk to you about is you take a more spiritual approach to this type of counseling and to your work in general. So, what made you start taking this spiritual approach? And why is it different to some of the traditional approaches that in mental health? What's different about it?
Good question. So that's when that, even though I started out as a Christian who was a counselor, I didn't necessarily feel like I was going to be operating as a Christian counselor. I had heard a couple things from counselors that I went to school with that put a bad taste in my mouth. Things like, I'm not gonna help a client if they're struggling with this particular type of sin. Like, that's just disgusting. Certain populations that they felt like were doomed for hellfire and brimstone. And I just thought, well, if that's what Christian counseling is, I don't want to do that. Here in the
Mm,
DFW Metroplex, we're in the Bible Belt. So most of the people that I work with already have a faith foundation. So I figured they already know that reading the Bible is going to be helpful. They already know that prayer is going to be helpful. How about I just go ahead and take a clinical approach and just tell them the things that they don't know, and then they can incorporate the things that they already know to do on top of that. So that's how I operated for probably the first 5 or 6 years of being in private practice. But then I started to notice that there were some really distinct ways that trauma and even spiritual warfare started to intersect with one another. And I remember I had one client in particular that was really grieving his mom and the loss of his mom. And
mm,
his question to me was, how do I contact the dead? And I'm thinking, oh boy, what have I got myself into here? And of course, I didn't want to create a stigma for him or create shame for him in any way. So I just stayed in the clinical lane of what does that loneliness do for you? What is that void still creating for you, a thirst that it's not quenching? And then when we started to address that and we started to close up that gap, spiritual things just started to happen for him in general. And he initiated the conversation without any knowledge that I was a Christian. One of his closing statements to me was, I'm ready to invite God back into my life. And so I just started to see how the trauma wound closing
mm,
also closed spiritual wounds too. And most of my clients who deal with spiritual trauma ultimately have parents who came from this do as I say, not as I do. I'm going to tell you you need God. I'm going to tell you you need to go to church. I'm going to tell you that you need the rod and that honoring your parents is what, but they're not operating as parents that are worthy of being honored. They've got addictions, they're adult, whatever the thing is, and we all have sins.
mm,
But the spiritual trauma actually came from parental trauma, and it displaced itself thinking, if I'm doomed for this kind of life anyway, why would a God of the universe accept me? Let me just go ahead
mm.
and sin and fail on my own terms. If I'm going to go straight to hell, I'll do it by choice. So it's just started to intersect with trauma on its own. And that's when I started to be a little bit more vocal or to sniff out the clients that wanted that to be an answer. And then we start having more direct conversations about how the spiritual world and trauma world intersect.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, and it's just kind of one of those ways that sometimes God will use other people, unexpected people,
Yeah,
in your life to kind of move you or nudge you in areas where you should be going. And I'm so thankful for those times in my life as well.
good
So
point.
before we get too far into this topic, we should define our terms, okay? So how would you define emotional trauma? And are there like different levels of emotional trauma?
Good question. The standard answer in the counseling world is that there's big T trauma, big events that cause really big problems for us, and there's little t trauma. That's really what I call the death by a thousand paper cuts kind of
Hmm.
approach. And it's actually fairly uncommon that I have somebody come into my office knowing that I'm a trauma therapist, say specifically, I've had this one big awful event that I just cannot get past.
Mm.
9 times out of 10, it's somebody who said, life has just sucked overall. And usually the people who are stuck the most are the people who try to logic their way and rationalize that that shouldn't be trauma. I shouldn't be upset about that. And the brain will fight back on them with that, and it'll actually exacerbate the mental health symptoms. So I haven't really operated in treating anybody differently when there's a big T trauma versus a little T trauma. We just treat trauma, period.
Yeah.
And usually when we do that, there's more room for them to say, okay, yeah, I guess being told that I wouldn't amount to anything was traumatic. And they'll validate the fact that even though I should complain because I've never been in a natural disaster and my parents never beat me, they're able to accept and then heal from and then move past the fact that criticism, just that constant dripping of rain, is cumulatively can be more traumatic than some really big awful event.
Yeah. I love how you pointed out that the majority of people that are struggling, that are stuck in their lives, it's not the one big thing. It's
Mm-mm.
it's lots of little things. And because I think sometimes when you go through a really big event, it's easy to see, oh, I'm going to need help to get over
Mhm.
this but whenever you go through those small little events, it's easy to ignore those or brush those off exactly like you said, like rationalizing or trying to tell yourself, oh, that's no big deal. I just need to get over it. But in fact, there's so many times when it's your body that's not getting over it. You know, you think you're over it, but your body's still reacting as if it's there. So I really
Yeah.
like how you pointed that out. So can you explain how trauma forms in the brain and especially like early in life, or if someone's been under like chronic stress, what you talked about, those 1,000 paper cuts. Can you explain how that forms?
Good question. So I'm going to answer this one a little bit more metaphorical because even when we get into brain science, all the names are confusing and they're overwhelming, and the thalamus and the
Mhm.
amygdala and all of that kind of stuff. So the easiest way to describe how trauma forms is actually with the Disney movie Inside Out. If you remember from the movie, they've got all these little orbs in the brain, and when the orbs didn't really mean anything, they were this gray color, signifying gray matter. When the orbs meant something, they were color coded based off of emotion. And so when something activating happens, the brain will sort it out based off of its threat level. So if I'm 5 years old and I hear from my parent, you're a disappointment, that orb is not going to go into gray matter because it's about our identity and it's a threat to our emotional safety and our belonging. So
Mm.
that orb will, in a sense, light up and it will send out little feelers to make sure that it stays hyper aware of that feeling again, because the brain would rather keep you miserable consistently rather than let it go and just be naive and hopeful and then be blindsided by something. So that little orb activates and it'll look for confirming experiences. And this is where confirmation bias can come into trauma and intersect. If you've never driven a blue Hyundai and then you buy a blue Hyundai, then everybody has got blue Hyundais. You find what
Mhm.
you're looking for. So because the brain says, I want to look for rejection because I don't want to be blindsided by that again, it categorizes in this MVP file the rejection components that unfortunately are normal day-to-day experiences. Kids are bullies, parents are grumpy, teachers are underpaid, whatever the thing is. But the brain will seek out and prioritize those rejections and then incorporate them into an identity file. So then it no longer becomes somebody said to me that I'm not enough. Somebody said to me I'm a disappointment. It that we absorb the meaning at that point and we say, I'm not enough. I will always be
Mm.
a failure. I'll never not fail. And then we create this self-fulfilling prophecy because those orbs just keep collecting and attaching. They do that enough, you get what's biblically known as a stronghold. And then you can't have an experience happen that confirms the opposite, that you do have value. You did something correct. You wanted this. The brain goes, no, no, no. I need to validate my experience of being a failure. And it'll just disregard the positive and it'll only count the negative.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know there's hope, but boy,
there is hope. And this is why I have a job. It's because this is hard to get past. But I love explaining this to people because they come in here feeling like a
Mhm.
failure, that they feel like a failure. They
Yeah.
hate the fact that they can't mind over matter something, but it's just the way that the brain was designed because it wants to not be blindsided. So we just shake that tree enough that the brain loses that attachment to that belief system. It lets go of that vow. And we can talk more about that later about how sometimes the things that we're stuck on are actually a vow we made to ourselves. If we just let go of that promise, well, I'm never going to trust anybody again. If we just release that, the brain goes, well, I guess I'm not allowed to default to that belief anymore. And then new data can come in.
Yeah. So that was going to be a follow-up question is, can you traumatize yourself? Can you
Yes.
create trauma on your own?
Yes. And I'll tell you the two main ways that people do that. The first way is that, again, I'm going to really oversimplify an answer. This is not the scientific way that this goes, but it helps for teaching purposes. If we look at the fact that depression is an obsession with the past and anxiety is an obsession with the future, our body does not know the difference between fantasy and reality. So if we're
Mm,
constantly living in the future and we're pulling things down, well, this could go wrong and this could, and then she's going to say this and I'm going to say this, your body will react as if that's actually happening. Just like you and I can sit in a shark movie and we could be sitting on a couch with some popcorn, being completely safe physically, and that shark jumps out and our nervous system reacts. We don't know that we're not in danger because logic and reasoning only go so far.
yeah.
So when we live in the future and we rehearse scenarios that could go wrong, because remember, the brain does not like to be blindsided, and we just keep ingesting that, I'm going to have control over this future. We've just re traumatized ourselves 16 more times than the actual one event happened. So the rehearsal is one of the biggest ways that we re traumatize ourselves.
The rehearsal, I like how you describe that.
Yeah.
So, and I think you've touched on it a little bit, but why do people sometimes react so strongly to situations that seem minor on the surface? What's happening neurologically? I think you explained it a little bit, but go into a little
Yeah.
bit more detail
Yeah.
with, just a tiny thing, and somehow it just can really set people off sometimes.
Good question. So yeah, that stronghold that we talked about, it's looking for those things and it's preparing to react, not based off of the one event, but based off of the cluster of the file. So if you and I are in a kitchen and then you tell me, hey, let me show you how to cook this particular meal, and my file is already, I'm not smart enough, then my
Mm,
file is going to pull up all the data on the subconscious level of all the people who've ever told me that. On a conscious level, I only know that you were trying to teach me something and that I reacted. But the body's like, oh, no, no, this isn't the first time this has happened. Remember, all of these other things have happened, and we're going to react not based off of the event, but we're going to react based off of the file of rejection that we have.
mm.
And that's why our reactions tend to be so much bigger than the event.
Wow. So, how does this unresolved trauma keep us in a state of reactivity, even though we know, like logically, like, well, I know better. I know that, this little event or this little thing isn't a big deal. So, how does this reactivity just kind of keep us there? Why can't we
Good.
just let it go?
Good, 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 good. And I'm glad you said it that way because it actually brings us to when we were talking about how we re-traumatize ourselves. And I told you there
Mhm.
was two ways that we do that. When we invalidate ourselves, our brain basically says, screw you, you're not in charge anymore. So when we go through an experience like that and we tell ourselves, well, this shouldn't bother you. If you were a normal person, you wouldn't react that way. Again, metaphorical, if our brain started out as balanced and then we have an emotional reaction to something that causes this swelling of the emotional centers of our brain, we're reacting to it. The only way that the brain will let go of that emotion is with validation. But what we do instead, especially in Christian circles, because we feel like shame is motivating,
Mhm.
is we will go ahead and have that emotion and then we'll try to shame ourselves out of that emotion, but then that actually doubles the trauma. It doubles the inflamed aspects of that emotion because now we hate ourselves. We're ashamed. We don't like, so it's gone from an event to an identity. So then it takes double the relief to get that puppy back in place. And so we have to remember, and I love the way that my coworker says this, you have to treat your emotions like kids in a car. You can't let them drive, but you can't put them in the trunk. And so when we put our kids in the trunk, we get a lot of different problems in place. And so we tend to try to do that with emotions. We tend to try to overpower them with logic. And if your body's saying, look, I'm anxious for a reason because you're a people pleaser and you keep saying yes to everybody, and I'm giving you an emotion and you're not paying attention to it, and now you're invalidating. So guess what? You get more lip from me, and you get more body shakes, and you get more heart palpitations, and you get more irrational
Mm.
responses because I'm going to do what I have to do to be to validate it. So when we listen to that and say, okay, my emotions were given to me, I was created with fear being a helpful emotion when I do it in the right spots.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid right now for a reason. Let me listen to my body enough to ask myself, why am I afraid? I'm afraid because I think that if I ask for what I need, that that person's going to abandon me. Okay, so what do I need to do about that? Is it a conversation I could have? I'm just scared to have. Is
Mm.
it a conversation that if I have, it'll create new consequences for me, which means that I have to address a bigger issue of is this relationship even a healthy relationship? It just uncaps some more things. But the point is that we start taking steps to resolve it. When we just ignore it and go, shut up, you, then the brain freaks out and it just hijacks and piracy happens and everybody dies.
There is hope, okay? There is hope.
There's hope. Everybody dies in that moment in terms of our logic and reasoning and our ability to mindfully act through something.
Yeah.
When we empathize with ourselves and we give our emotions a voice to have an opinion and have it matter, but it's not to lead us and just, oh, well, my gut's telling me that this has happened. Yeah, your gut is judging based off of past experiences. It's not a crystal
Hmm.
ball for the future. We've got to learn that balance, and then that helps us resolve those issues and those reactions.
Yeah. I really like how you pointed out, how this process can keep you stuck. And I hope for the, people out there, you can give yourself a little bit of grace. Um, like, oh, this isn't good. It doesn't excuse things, but it does, give you an understanding of like what's going on the inside, and it
Yes.
helps make you aware of, okay, I need to address and release and deal with some of these things. But I hope also as believers, we can understand why some, as my former pastor used to say, interesting people, people that act in interesting ways, we should give grace to them as well,
Yes.
because we're so quick to give ourselves grace or make excuses for our behavior. But when you
Hmm.
see others, it's to hear what's going on the inside. It really helps, give an understanding as to why, their
Yeah.
nervous system, their brain, their body is, you
It's
know,
dysregulated. It's
it's
stuck.
dysregulated. Yeah.
And we don't know what's going on in their body. They
Hmm.
may have blood sugar problems, they may have a toxic load, just like we know we don't act the way that we want to act if we're inebriated with alcohol. There is a drugging that happens. There's an
Hmm.
influence, there's an inhibition that happens when trauma is a part of our lives. And who we are and what our best foot forward looks like is not always visible to people when we've had those experiences. And usually when we meet somebody with empathy and when we give them the benefit of the doubt to say, okay, most people aren't trying to ruin other people's lives. They're just reacting
Hmm.
and moving through the world in the way that they were taught. When we give people the benefit of the doubt, sometimes it actually gives that person permission to heal.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's that's a powerful thing to say.
Yeah.
So, what are some signs that a person might be carrying around this unresolved trauma, even when they don't recognize it?
Good question. I think the easiest answer for that in the lanes that you and I both travel in is when we start to have physical symptoms. That is a sign that something emotional is not being dealt with. And
Mm,
so, usually in my world, repressed emotion first starts as IBS. Maybe it'll move to the thyroid. There's different ways that the body starts to lose momentum because of the fact that repressing has gone on over and over and over again.
mhm,
Sometimes we pay attention to what our body's doing more than we do our emotions because we just respect the body more than we do the mind for some reason. So I love the little heart rate tracker on the watches.
mhm.
We try to keep our electronics down and the influence of that. But when your watch says, "Hey, your heart rate's up. Is everything okay?" We're just being able to listen to that and say, "Oh, dang, my heart rate is up. Yeah, my shoulders are tense. Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean that I need more self-care right now? Does that mean I need more water right now? Is that a further reason to prioritize the fact that I let sleep go because I was self-medicating with TV? Like just letting the body symptom leave you a breadcrumb trail to figure out what your body's trying to communicate to you and what it wants you to address.
Yeah, the, that's interesting. So, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, you know,
Mhm.
d gut issues,
Gut issues
um,
is where it tends to start. Yeah.
is a big thing, and thyroid issues is a big
Mm-hmm.
thing. That's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does our spiritual life play a role in healing from trauma?
Good question. The simplest answer is a lot of anxiety comes from us not having control and having an unrealistic belief about what level of control we should have. So from the general standpoint of recognizing that there's somebody at power who's strong and who's wise and who's for you, just feeling like you're not alone in something
Hmm.
can be really powerful in just recognizing, yeah, I don't have to have control, but I'm not in this alone, and I serve a God who's for me.
Yeah.
So there can be relief when we tap into our relationship with God of just the idea that we don't have to figure all this out and we have access to the person who does know how to figure all this out. There's a
Yeah.
relief that comes just from that. The other layer to that is that the quote unquote rules of the Bible, or what I would call the safety bumpers for life, really are helpful. Yeah,
Hmm.
being an alcoholic is not helpful. The Bible told us that. Being a glutton is not helpful. The Bible told us that. Spreading your wild oats is not helpful. The Bible told us that. So when it just helps us kind of keep ourselves centered on there's ways that we might be tempted to go, but it's going to create new consequences for us.
Hmm.
That in itself can prevent failure from things because then we're not a part of our own trauma by being attracted to chaos. And then we pick the guy who loves to beat women up, but just because that's what's familiar and that's what we know, it resets our desires from what they tend to be and what our experiences tend to make us think they should be. And it moves us forward into the plan that God has for us. And then if you take that to another layer to say, that spiritually there's a legal system involved. And if you are not giving Jesus full authority to remediate the things that he needs to remediate, then just like if I had an Airbnb that I never go and check on, I could have squatters in that area. And even though I may say that Jesus is the landlord, if there's not constant movement and constant involvement in that space, you can pick up some really oppressive things by
Hmm.
just, assuming that, being a part of your life every so often is enough. There's just levels of that.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think God uses trauma in our lives to ultimately bring about his goodness and his purpose
Mm,
for you?
yeah. I think that goes back to how I stumbled into counseling in just the fact that we can use what was meant as a weapon against us as a weapon
Hmm.
for the offense. And so anytime we go through something and we have experience and we let God and we let loving people be a part of that solution, it qualifies us for a different level of expertise and a different level of relatability. And at the same way, we tend to assume that adversity means I've done something wrong or God has forgotten me. But you and I know that the most interesting people we have ever met and the people who actually bring something to this world are people who've had to fight for it. Anytime you meet somebody who has just been handed things and has been entitled and has been babied and has been coddled, those people are pretty worthless. And I'm not saying that from like a judgment standpoint. I'm saying like everybody's redeemable. Everybody can step it up.
Yes.
But if we want to be people who make an impact, if we want to be people who leave a fingerprint on this world, we have to be ready for the fact that adversity is what qualifies us for that. You don't get one without the other.
Dang it.
Yeah,
Why does it have to be so hard?
I know.
So, you've given us so much great information and insight into trauma and emotions and the role that those things can play in not only, keeping us stuck in our mindset, but keeping us stuck with physical ailments, with chronic illness. What are some examples, or can you think of some examples of some chronic illnesses or other symptoms besides, just maybe gut issues where people are stuck? Um, and, and do you have any cases of an individual that might have been stuck with a certain issue and working through some of this emotional trauma made
Yeah,
a difference for them?
yeah. There's a few that are coming to mind. So I think one of the questions that we have to ask when we have a physical issue coming into play is there actually a way that that physical issue is helpful to us? So for example, I'm thinking of one guy in particular that was dealing with Parkinson's, and he was really afraid of being left by his wife.
Mm,
And there, even though he's miserable in his symptoms, there was a lot of barriers to him not wanting to do the things that would help his symptoms because he had this underlying belief that if I get well, I'm going to get left. The only reason
mm,
she's sticking around is because I need a caregiver right now. And even though we know Parkinson's is like way downstream of the type of symptoms that you can get and toxins that can build, really the main thing that was making him sick was a fear of abandonment. And keeping
mm.
that disease around was really the thing that made him feel safe. I have to stay sick or I'm going to get left. So when we zoom that back out then and say, are there ways that our physical symptoms actually create an escape for us? I've got one client in particular that is probably one of the worst cases of Lyme or mold toxicity that I've ever seen. But with as young as he is, he still has a lot of future. There's a lot of hopefulness about how this could go. But he's really concerned that if he doesn't stay home, his parents are going to split up. Like by him being
Mm.
somebody that keeps them together, his illness being their focal point, he feels like this is the only way that my family is going to stay intact.
Wow.
So one of the things we have to address is there some sort of belief that illness is actually keeping things in place for us? And if there's a purpose that serves, it doesn't matter what supplements you take. Just like the placebo effect can go on the back way, your body's going to reject the treatment if it feels like it goes against your original goal. So, there's obviously spaces in between that, but a lot of chronic illness really comes down to a feeling of being trapped,
Mm.
particularly with parents. I cannot stand up to them for either religious dogma that I've been taught about how I need to honor them, or I just don't want to be alone. So I have to just sit here and take the verbal abuse, even as an adult. I'm afraid I'll lose my siblings, or I just can't imagine what life would be like on the other side of this. The healing is just so blind and so foreign. I don't know what that life looks like, that I'm actually more
Mhm.
afraid of what that space looks like. So I need to acknowledge the fact that the illness is serving me in some way. And so the illness will sometimes keep people away. The simplest example of that is, well, if I'm sick, people will lower their expectations of me. I can get out of social engagements. I can avoid confrontation because people know that I'm having a flare up. And I'm not saying that people are wishing these illnesses on
No,
them. We're talking about this being
no.
at a subconscious
Yeah.
level. So there's some intertwining of what trauma does to us for our belief systems and how empowered we feel in the relationships around us, where sometimes the medical issues feel like they're the only thing protecting us. Now,
Mhm.
the other layer to that is how the nervous system works. You know, in the lanes that we've operated with, that the vagus nerve is a really powerful part of whether things are working right or not working right. So that vagus nerve is wandering through all of the organs of your body. It has access to touch everything, but its efficacy is only as good as our parasympathetic rest and digest state is. So if trauma has taught us to constantly be in a fight or flight response, if it tells us we can't turn off, basically the body goes, okay, emotional or physical safety from not getting beat or not getting rejected is more important. So I don't have time to also then go and navigate this toxin and remediate it out of my body if I ingested a parasite, or if I got heavy metals from something. I can't go work
Yeah.
on the detox process of that because I need to keep my wits about me, and I have to
Mm.
prioritize circulation and blood functioning to my feet so that I can flee the situation if I need to. So basically, our organs go through this metaphorical circulation starvation, and then we're wondering why we're mineral deficient or this or that, but it's really just because our body can only do so much. And if you tell it, hey, you need to protect us from rejection, it goes, okay, well, I guess the liver's got to take the hit this time, and it just, things start falling apart.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So thank you so much for opening our eyes to emotional trauma and the effect that it can have on the body physically, and how those things can manifest, and how um, those things, if we let them, can keep us stuck in a state of chronic illness. But also, if we release them, how there's hope and how God can use those things to bring about um, blessing for others, yourself and so many others. So, Dr. Julie, if somebody wanted to connect with you or learn more about what you do, how could someone get in touch with you?
Yeah. So my website is amplifiedwellness.site. I have a sign up sheet for people who want to reach out and want to connect on there. The only thing I'd like to warn people about is that when it comes to counseling, counseling is state specific. And so I could only take a counseling role for somebody at this moment who's in the state of Texas. My license in Oklahoma is about to be approved too. So at least at the time of this recording, it would be Texas. But wellness practices or coaching components can be reached out to at the amplifiedwellness.site.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay tuned for part two, where Dr. Julie walks us through some ways that we can begin healing, some ways that we can recognize areas that we need healing, and we can begin to release some of these emotional traumas coming out next week. So stay tuned for our part two episode with Dr. Julie. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to the Discover Health podcast. Remember, your health is a journey, not a destination. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next week.